As a foodie, today's episode excites and horrifies me. We are diving into history's most savage food challenges to see how far people will go for a brutal dare. From a man who chugged over a gallon of homemade pickle brine to a woman whose cooking competition ended inside a giant pot of boiling paella. It was July 3rd, 2017, at a lakeside reserve outside Hamilton, New Zealand. The warmth of that afternoon was a lie. A perfect stage for a body that had been quietly failing for years to finally, fatally betray itself. Kieran Moana was 38 years old and worked as a forklift mechanic at a regional logistics depot, a position he had held for 9 years. He had been fatigued for years, heavy limbs after shifts, persistent thirst, occasional muscle cramping, and attributed all of it to long hours and physical work. He had not seen a doctor about it in several years. And I don't think fatigue being mistaken for hard work is unique to Kieran. Most people reading this have done that same math at some point. What no one at the reunion knew, and what Kieran likely suspected even less, was that his kidneys had been operating at a fraction of their normal capacity for some time. The dare began the way most family dares begin, incrementally and with laughter. After the food was gone, someone noticed the large glass jug of homemade pickle brine sitting near the cooler. Kieran's older brother finished close to half a gallon before stopping, to general applause. By that point, the dynamic was already fixed. Now, as you know, dares at reunions have a particular social architecture. Refusal carries more weight than participation. And Kieran had never been someone who handled refusal well in front of an audience. He picked up the remaining brine. Relatives cheered. A few protested mildly. He pushed through roughly 3 quarts despite gagging visibly on multiple occasions, his face reddening, his jaw working against the effort. The homemade brine had been prepared with a potassium-rich salt substitute, leaving it with an unusually high potassium concentration that nobody present realized. He set the jug down to applause. Over the next 15 to 20 minutes, he sat heavily on the bench and said his arms felt heavy. A cousin assumed it was nausea from the volume and handed him water. He did not drink it. A few minutes later, he complained that his legs felt weak, and he struggled to stand without steadying himself against the table. A woman seated across the table noticed his posture had changed, not the theatrical slump of someone being funny, but something quieter and more alarming. His forearms rested flat on the table, and he was not lifting them. His coloring had shifted in a way she found difficult to describe to paramedics afterward. I've read accounts like this before, and there's always that specific moment when the people closest still aren't sure whether to laugh or run. He slid sideways off the bench. His brother caught part of the fall, but not all of it. He was on the ground, conscious but unresponsive to his name. His breathing became slow and irregular. His niece, 14 years old, called emergency services. Rural paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. The nearest facility with emergency dialysis capability was more than 40 miles away. Paramedics saw his heart rhythm rapidly deteriorate before it stopped completely. Despite multiple rounds of CPR, they couldn't revive him. The coroner determined that he had undiagnosed end-stage kidney disease, and the massive amount of potassium from the homemade pickle brine overwhelmed his body, causing his heart to stop. What strikes me about the brine being homemade is that the potassium concentration was completely unmeasured. Nobody at that table had any way of knowing what they were handing him. The reunion was not held the following year. When it resumed, the competitive food games did not return with it. Kieran's brother has not spoken about that afternoon in any detail since. His aunt quietly removed the brine recipe from the family cookbook she had been assembling for years. I think grief works like that. It doesn't announce itself, it just removes things. A recipe, a tradition, an afternoon that seemed harmless for decades until the day it wasn't. That's one way to start a video, a dare that costs nothing to refuse and everything to accept. The next one also started as a performance, except this time it happened in a remote area. It was October 18, 2014, at a hunting cabin roughly 25 miles outside Prince George, British Columbia. 11 men had gathered there over a long weekend, and by Saturday night, What started as a cookout had folded into something with a $5,000 prize and a cooler full of harvested animal organs no one had bothered to label. Nolan Freese was 41, a heavy equipment operator with over 15 years running bulldozers and excavators across remote British Columbia job sites. He was physically capable, methodically self-reliant, and known among his crew as someone who did not rattle easily. He survival camped alone for stretches of up to 4 days and considered discomfort a management problem rather than a deterrent. Among his long-standing friend group, he had a well-documented habit of accepting wagers that had no business being accepted.
Look, I respect a guy who can handle himself in the bush, but that last line is basically a flashing neon sign that reads "Trouble Incoming."
The bet was structured loosely. Each participant reached blindly into a cooler containing raw organs harvested from legally taken game animals. Whatever you drew, you consumed. Most draws were manageable. When Nolan pulled a raw black bear diaphragm and looked at it for approximately 3 seconds before swallowing it in 2 movements, the room reacted the way rooms do, when someone does something that lands between impressive and horrifying. Honestly, if I were in that room, I'd be cheering and vomiting at the same time. He pocketed the cash before anyone had fully processed what they had witnessed. Some things are just dumb from the start, and a room full of grown men watching someone eat a raw bear organ for money is exactly that kind of thing. His decision was not random. Nolan had eaten game his entire adult life. He understood harvest, field dressing, and the rough chain from animal to table. What he did not account for, what most people in that room almost certainly did not account for, is that bear meat carries a documented and well-established risk of trichinella, a parasitic roundworm that survives in raw or undercooked muscle tissue and has a documented history of severe human infection. Cooking kills it. Swallowing it whole in a dim cabin on a Saturday night does not. I'm no biologist, but even my half-asleep brain knows you don't raw dog bear meat. 2 weeks passed. Nolan told people his muscles ached from a long push at work. He ran a low fever and slept more than usual, attributing it to the same job site fatigue he had managed for 15 years.
I think those symptoms in isolation would not have registered as alarming to almost anyone.
Over the following month, the symptoms lingered instead of improving. He developed worsening fatigue, persistent muscle pain, and continued losing weight, but still insisted he was simply worn down from work. At a follow-up gathering roughly 7 weeks after the wager, a small celebration of his winnings, witnesses noted he looked visibly thinner. His face was drawn. He had lost weight that no one could account for. He raised a drink. Then his arm dropped. He turned, sat heavily on a bench, and went down sideways onto the floor. Witnesses described his body jerking in brief, rigid convulsions before the movements suddenly stopped. He was unresponsive and not breathing normally. 3 men immediately began CPR rotations, while a 4th ran to retrieve an automated defibrillator from a work truck parked outside. During rhythm analyses, the monitor advised ventricular fibrillation and delivered 3 shocks. His heart did not return to a stable rhythm. The compressions continued without interruption. One guest placed a call to emergency services. I cannot imagine what it felt like to stand in that room running CPR on someone who 7 weeks earlier had been laughing. Paramedics reached the cabin 18 minutes after the call, navigating the access road in the dark. Advanced life support was continued at the scene and during transport, but he did not survive. The autopsy findings described widespread trichinella infection throughout the skeletal and cardiac muscle tissue.
In plain terms, the parasite had migrated from his digestive tract into his muscles, including his heart, triggering inflammation severe enough to disrupt its electrical function.
Nolan was buried the following week. His crew attended. His personal hand tools sat where he had last left them on a job site in northern British Columbia for longer than anyone expected, because the foreman said no one felt like moving them. Now, if Nolan died from something that took 7 weeks to kill him, our next victim didn't get that kind of time. His 4 seconds cost him 3 days. It was November 28th, 2016, in a rented student apartment near a university in Yekaterinburg, Russia, where the warmth of a crowded room full of young men felt like permission for things that would look very different in the morning. Denis Polanskaya was 31 and worked as an electrical technician for a regional infrastructure firm, maintaining high-voltage relay systems across 3 substations. But Dennis had a second identity he kept alive through annual visits to an unofficial alumni initiation gathering organized by former members of a long-running student engineering club where younger members knew him by reputation before they knew him by name. There is a particular kind of pride that functions as its own trap, and Denis had been carrying his version of it for over a decade.
Now, I don't know much about him, but I think he likely came to alumni nights to remind himself and others that he still could.
The ritual that night rotated new members through stations the organizers called elemental challenges. The nitrogen station required eating cereal, flash frozen with liquid nitrogen, but only after the visible vapor had fully dissipated, a process that takes longer than most people assume, and far longer than anyone in that room was tracking. I find it genuinely unsettling how a detail that small can be the entire difference between a bad night and a funeral. Denis had been drinking not visibly impaired, witnesses said, but louder and more competitive than usual. He watched 2 new members hesitate and decided the moment called for a demonstration. He took a fresh bowl, one that had not cleared, and ate several large spoonfuls without pausing. Witnesses said he barely chewed. The room responded exactly as he wanted. Noise, laughter, attention from the new members, approval from the alumni. Within roughly 30 seconds, he bent forward with both hands on his knees. Witnesses described it as sudden and complete, not gradual. He straightened and told everyone he was fine, that it was just cold, and waved off anyone who moved toward him. One person nearby laughed. Another stepped back and said nothing.
Imagine seeing this across a crowded room when someone doubles over and immediately insists you ignore it. There is a specific social pressure in that moment that almost nobody pushes back against.
The laughter in the room continued for a while. By the end of the night, most of the group had dispersed without incident. Friends who drove him home noted he walked with one arm pressed across his midsection but said nothing and did not ask for help. By the second day, 3 friends who visited described his abdomen as visibly distended and unusually firm, and reported he had vomited twice that morning. He told them it was food poisoning. You're literally bloated like a balloon and puking. How do you convince yourself that's just bad food? By the 3rd day, he could not stand without support. A friend called emergency services at approximately 9 in the evening on November 17th after arriving at his apartment and finding him on the bathroom floor. He was admitted in critical condition with signs of acute sepsis. Physicians determined that residual liquid nitrogen had rapidly expanded into gas inside his stomach, while also causing severe cold injury to the stomach lining. Over the following days, the damaged tissue progressively died and weakened before the stomach wall ultimately perforated. The rupture allowed gastric contents to spill into the abdominal cavity, causing peritonitis. He died from widespread bacterial infection and septic shock, despite emergency surgery. The Student Engineering Club was permanently dissolved, and organizers became the focus of a criminal negligence investigation after testimony from new members confirmed every detail of how the station had been run that night.
Hazing has killed people for decades, and the fact that it still requires a body in the room before real consequences follow is something I find genuinely indefensible.
Denis spent 3 days dying from a decision that took roughly 4 seconds to make inside a room full of people who watched it happen, laughed at it, and went home afterward. And if Denis performed for a room full of people who laughed, our next story is about a man who performed for a room full of people who all went quiet. It was the 14th of September, 2019, at a small gastropub and brewery on the east side of Guadalajara, Mexico. The final terms of a contest were already being written, even if the waiver Milo signed didn't mention them. Milo Guadalupe was 22 and worked as a warehouse inventory clerk at a distribution facility on the industrial edge of the city. On weekends, he competed in local trivia nights and pub contests for free prizes. Not for money exactly, but for the standing it gave him in rooms where standing was earned by performance. The gastropub's permanent challenge had a leaderboard mounted near the bar. Eat 15 Carolina Reapers in under 2 minutes, and the prize was free beer for a year. He had read about it weeks before the night he showed up to attempt it.
Before you judge me, think about what a contest like that represents to someone at 22. Not danger exactly, but the kind of low-stakes wager that feels designed to be won.
He signed the waiver at the bar without ceremony. Several previous contestants were present that evening. The setup was straightforward. 15 peppers on a plate, a countdown clock on a screen above the leaderboard. A staff member certified in first aid was stationed near the side wall with an epinephrine kit and portable oxygen standard for the challenge, not considered alarming. The crowd numbered between 40 and 60 people. Several had phones out. I will say this clearly. Watching the first 45 seconds of Milo's attempt, without knowing what follows, looks exactly like someone winning. The coughing started around 90 seconds in. It was not the reflexive cough that follows intense heat. It was deeper, more structural, the kind that bends a person at the waist and does not release cleanly. Witnesses described the sound as distinct from what the peppers usually produced. His shoulders pulled upward as the muscles in his neck strained with each breath. His face had changed in a way two separate witnesses independently noted, not red the way heat makes you red, but something grayer, something that didn't track with ordinary discomfort. He gripped the counter edge with both hands. The room went quieter in sections, the silence spreading backward as people toward the front stopped reacting, in the way people stop reacting when a situation reclassifies itself. He did not fall immediately.
For several seconds, he remained standing in a posture witnesses described as held rather than balanced. Upright, but not functional.
His breathing was audible from several yards away, a high, tight pull on each inhale with almost nothing returning. Then his knees gave, and he went down beside the leaderboard. The staff member reached him within seconds and began providing oxygen, while another employee retrieved the epinephrine kit. Another contestant near the rear of the room placed the emergency call. An ambulance arrived within several minutes and transported him to a major emergency hospital approximately 12 minutes away. He never regained meaningful consciousness during transport. The coroner's findings identified the cause of death as complications of a severe acute asthma attack triggered by intense capsaicin exposure in a person with a documented history of asthma. Severe bronchospasm prevented adequate oxygen from reaching his bloodstream. An irreversible hypoxic brain injury had already occurred before he reached the hospital. In the weeks following, the gastropub quietly retired the challenge and removed the leaderboard without any public statement changes that came too late to matter for the only person they might have actually protected. I think the absence of any public acknowledgement is its own kind of answer about accountability. Milo Guadalupe spent his weekends earning standing in rooms full of people. He was 22, methodical, and genuinely good at reading the terms of a contest. This one had a condition that was not on the waiver. Milo had a medic standing by and a crowd that moved the moment he went down, and he still didn't make it out. The next one won first, walked off stage with a trophy, and didn't understand what was already in motion until he was on the floor at home. It was May 12th, 2018, at a provincial agricultural fair on the outskirts of Chengdu, China. The fair had run for 11 consecutive years without serious incident. That afternoon would not extend that record. Ren Ziyi was 36 years old and operated a small appliance repair shop in a residential district near the city center. He had a reputation among neighbors as a meticulous and patient man, someone who fixed things other shops turned away, who charged less than he probably should have. He had placed second in the fair's eating competition the 2 prior years. The featured event was a fried butter challenge, thick battered sticks, deep fried until the exterior hardened and the interior reduced to near liquid. Each stick weighed roughly 3 ounces. The defending champion was younger and had a longer competitive record, and Ren understood that clearly. He did not pace himself.
I think anyone watching from the crowd would have recognized his strategy immediately. He wasn't eating to win on points. He was eating to make it impossible for anyone to close the gap.
By the halfway mark, he had already surpassed his total from the prior year. Ren swallowed 16 sticks before time was called, enough fat to represent several days of ordinary intake, compressed into under 30 minutes. The crowd responded loudly. He raised both arms. I've thought about what drives someone to keep going past the point their body starts signaling. It isn't always recklessness. Sometimes it's someone who has spent years pushing through discomfort until they can no longer distinguish between the kind that passes and the kind that doesn't. On stage, he pressed his right hand against his upper abdomen and told a contest organizer nearby that something felt unusually tight. His face, captured in footage from a fairgoer's phone, was not the face of a man celebrating without reservation. The organizer told him it was probably the volume, handed him water, and noted the winner's photo session was scheduled later that week. Ren accepted the trophy. By evening, witnesses at his home, his wife, and a neighbor who had stopped by described him as visibly deteriorated. He vomited repeatedly over several hours, was unable to retain water, and at one point lowered himself to the floor and remained there. His wife told emergency staff the following morning that he had resisted going to the hospital until the pain became something he could no longer negotiate around. They left for the emergency department in the early hours, arriving roughly 45 minutes after departing home. The attending physician described fulminant acute pancreatitis, the most severe classification, meaning inflammation progressed faster than intervention could contain it. The extreme fat intake was considered the likely trigger for an episode of pancreatitis, possibly exposing an underlying susceptibility that had never been diagnosed, and the pancreas had begun releasing its own digestive enzymes into surrounding tissue. That process triggered a cascade over the following days: systemic inflammatory response, circulatory shock, kidney failure, then respiratory failure. Each system that failed placed additional strain on whatever remained functional. He died before the fair's official winner's photo session could be scheduled, and his wife was present throughout. No trophy is worth that, and I think that sentence is so obvious it should never have needed to be written about a real person. The fair organization removed the fried butter event from all future programming and replaced it with a timed pastry challenge. The trophy was never formally presented at a ceremony. I think about his wife carrying it home and what that object must have meant once it was sitting in a house that had become very quiet. If Ren Ziyi spent days dying for a trophy he never got to be photographed with, the next person traded hers for tradition. It was June 16th, 2018, at an annual seafood festival in Valencia. The event would soon be defined by a single, terrible miscalculation as the crowd began its countdown. Nerea Solis was 34 years old and worked as a warehouse supervisor for a regional logistics firm, overseeing daily operations and a floor crew of roughly 20 workers. She competed regularly in local strength competitions, not professionally, but seriously. Her co-workers had entered her in the festival's cooking challenge as a joke, and she had accepted the way people do when they already plan to win. She arrived in work boots and a canvas denim apron provided by the event, carrying the easy confidence of someone accustomed to moving heavy things in poor conditions. The challenge had run for several years without documented serious injury. Contestants stood on removable wooden planks spanning the rim of a steel cauldron nearly 10 feet across, containing roughly 500 gallons of simmering broth to create a big paella, and transferred large quantities of shellfish toward the center within a timed countdown.
The elevated plank setup had become a long-standing festival tradition, despite recurring concerns about how exposed it left participants.
I've tried to imagine what the risk assessment for this looked like on paper, and I genuinely cannot. Volunteers wiped the planks down periodically, but steam condensed on the surface continuously, and by mid-afternoon the wood had been cycled through wet and dry more times than anyone had tracked. And this is where I lost my mind. How do you look at wet wood over boiling death and say, yeah, this is fine, for years? Having said that, her decision to participate wasn't reckless in any obvious sense. The event was sanctioned and staffed, and her physical background made the task feel manageable. What neither she nor the organizers had fully accounted for was that condensation, smooth boot soles, and a dynamic weight shift left no margin for error. The crowd began counting down. Nerea lifted a 50-pound sack of mussels and started rotating toward the cauldron's center. Witnesses roughly 15 feet back described her stance as controlled until the instant it wasn't. Her right boot lost contact with the plank, She pitched forward from the hips, arms still holding the sack, and went over the rim, chest first. The broth was at a near boil, measuring roughly 200 to 212 degrees Fahrenheit. The apron, fully waterlogged within seconds, restricted her arm movement. She surfaced once, roughly 4 seconds after impact, her movements sharp and uncoordinated, before going under again. Reading that she surfaced with that apron dragging her down makes my stomach turn, that fabric became her coffin wrapping in seconds. Volunteers moved toward the rim with long-handled paddles, but pulled back almost immediately from the heat. 2 cooks used an oversized perforated skimmer and long paddles to bring her within arm's reach of the rim. Several volunteers then grabbed her clothing and pulled her over the edge. The entire sequence took approximately 20 to 30 seconds from the moment she fell. She was unconscious when they set her on the platform. Her skin showed immediate and extensive scalding across her chest and upper body. Her airway had already begun to swell. Festival staff called emergency services at the moment of the fall. Firefighters and paramedics arrived in 8 minutes. She went into cardiac arrest during transport despite advanced airway management. 8 minutes in that condition might as well have been 8 hours. Her fate was sealed the moment she hit that broth. The coroner identified the cause of death as complications of severe thermal injuries with acute inhalation injury. Contributing factors included extensive deep scald burns across the chest, abdomen, and upper extremities, and acute inhalation burns to the upper airway causing rapid respiratory failure. The heat had overwhelmed her airway faster than it could be managed. 3 days later, her funeral was held at her family's parish church in Valencia, where relatives, co-workers, and dozens of festival volunteers gathered in quiet attendance. Several co-workers carried her casket, while organizers of the seafood festival publicly expressed their condolences and suspended the cooking challenge pending a formal safety review. Here's my raw take on this whole nightmare. Neria didn't die because she was reckless or clumsy. She died because a bunch of adults decided tradition was more important than physics, and I find that absolutely unforgivable. That festival should be ashamed, and no safety review in the world will bring back that woman who just wanted to win a damn cooking contest.